Welcome to Fluent Daily, the English listening channel for advanced learners at B2 and C1 level. Every episode features a rich, flowing conversation in natural English on a topic that is genuinely worth thinking about: history, psychology, science, philosophy, and more. There are no simplified sentences here, no slow speech, no vocabulary drills. Just real English spoken naturally on ideas that matter. This is Fluent Daily. Let's get into it.
Today we have a great story, so let's get started right now.
If you open up the legal code governing a multinational tech giant today, say Apple or Amazon, and you trace the concept of a corporation back to its absolute origin, you might assume you'd end up in Silicon Valley. Or maybe, Wall Street in the 1980s.
Right, that would be the logical guess.
Yeah, but you won't. You will actually end up standing in front of a Roman bureaucrat 2,000 years ago who just invented a brilliant legal loophole so a local bakers guild could own a building.
It's amazing.
It is. Welcome to today's deep dive. If you're looking to cut through the noise and understand the invisible architecture of the world around you, you are exactly where you need to be. Today, we are embarking on an exploration of the Roman Empire, but I want to be crystal clear right out of the gate.
Yeah, this is important.
This isn't a dusty history lesson about marble statues and, men in togas. This is about the legacy code running our modern world.
I mean, it really is the ultimate operating system of Western civilization. When we look at the vocabulary of our politics, the layout of our cities, or even the legal frameworks that govern our daily transactions, we aren't looking at something that was just invented from scratch a few generations ago.
Right.
We are interacting with systems built, tested, and eventually broken by Rome. My goal today is to help us unpack not just what Rome built, but actually how a society achieves that staggering level of complexity. And, crucially, how even the most durable institutions in human history can just, slowly unravel.
So we're not just looking at a museum exhibit. We are looking at the foundational programming of our reality. And to start, I think we need to just look at our modern surroundings and identify exactly what the Romans left behind.
Yeah.
Because once you actually start looking for it, it's terrifyingly pervasive.
It really is everywhere once you tune your eyes to it.
Right. Take the legal systems across continental Europe, Latin America, and much of Africa. These aren't just inspired by Rome. They descend directly from Roman civil law.
That's a vital distinction. They are direct evolutionary descendants. So things like the mechanisms of property transfer, the concept of liability, the way contracts are enforced, these were literally engineered by Roman jurists. And it extends far beyond secular law, too. Like, look at the Catholic Church.
Oh, man, this is one of those facts that just fundamentally shifts how you see the world.
Mm-hmm.
When you look at the institutional structure of the Catholic Church, the hierarchy, the territorial organization into dioceses, the fact that they use Latin as a ceremonial language.
Yeah.
That isn't a uniquely religious design. That is literally just the administrative skeleton of the Roman Empire, repurposed.
Exactly. I always tell people to imagine a massive corporate headquarters where the original company goes bankrupt. But a new startup just moves into the empty offices, keeps the exact same floor plans, and uses the same filing cabinets.
That is such a good analogy.
Right. When the political apparatus of the Roman Empire faded in the West, that administrative shell was left standing. The Christian bishops essentially took over the geographic boundaries of the old Roman administrative districts.
Because it just made sense.
Exactly. Like, the word diocese was originally just a Roman provincial division. They preserved the bureaucratic machinery because it worked.
It's literally hiding in plain sight.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, it's in our mouths, too. We use the vocabulary of Western politics every single day without a second thought. Think about the words we use to organize power: republic, senate, emperor, constitution, province, citizen, magistrate, veto, census.
Just a massive list.
Right. And every single one of those concepts was forged in the Roman political furnace. And it's not just abstract ideas either. It's the physical reality beneath our feet. Like, if you travel across Britain, North Africa, or the Middle East, the physical infrastructure, the roads, the aqueducts, the fundamental grid layouts of major cities, it's all still there.
Yeah, and in many cases, you are driving or walking on routes that were plotted by Roman engineers over 2 millennia ago.
It's wild.
Which is why analyzing this isn't, it's not an exercise in antiquarianism. We aren't doing this because it's charming or old. Rome is the origin point for a disproportionate share of the English-speaking world's collective life.
Absolutely.
If you want to understand the limits and the vulnerabilities of the institutions operative right now, today, well, Rome provides the most comprehensive data set in human history.
I really love that framework. We are interacting with the user interface, but Rome wrote the kernel. But, if Rome is the underlying operating system, that brings up a really pressing question. What happens when we look at the code of how complex political systems rise, sustain themselves, and eventually crash?
Well, that specific question has been, basically the holy grail of historical analysis for centuries. Ever since Edward Gibbon published his massive work on the decline and fall of the empire in the late 18th century, scholars have just obsessed over Rome's trajectory.
And it makes sense why.
Totally. And the reason that obsession endures is that the patterns of Roman imperial dynamics, like how they grew, how they managed incredible diversity, how they fractured from within, they recur. You see echoes of them in every subsequent empire and superpower.
Well, let's start at the beginning of that trajectory. Because if we want to understand how the system eventually crashed, we have to understand how it was originally programmed. We need to trace this political transformation, which is honestly a massive arc. We're talking about roughly 8 centuries of development just to get to the empire.
Yeah, it's a staggering timeline. It goes from the traditional founding date of the city, which is 753 BCE, all the way to the assassination of Julius Caesar in 44 BCE. So it begins as this tiny, totally insignificant city-state in central Italy and ruthlessly expands into the dominant power of the entire Mediterranean basin.
Let's focus on the Roman Republic for a minute, which begins around 509 BCE. This is right after they expelled their last king, an Etruscan monarch. And basically, the Romans developed this deeply ingrained, almost pathological hatred of the concept of a king.
Oh, yeah, a deep cultural allergy to monarchy.
Right. They decide that no single man will ever hold absolute power again.
And to ensure that, they engineer an extraordinarily sophisticated constitutional arrangement. I mean, the entire architecture of the Republic was designed around a very specific goal, which was balancing competing class interests to prevent tyranny.
Let's break down how that balance actually worked, because I think it sounds remarkably familiar to a lot of modern listeners.
Yeah.
You had the wealthy elite, right, the patricians, and later the wealthy plebeians.
Yeah.
They were represented in the Senate,
Right.
which advised the magistrates and controlled foreign policy and finances.
Right.
And then you had the broader citizen body, represented through popular assemblies. These assemblies elected the officials and actually passed the laws. And to protect the common people, they had specific officials called the tribunes of the plebes.
This is where we really see the seeds of modern bicameral legislatures. You have a system that is deliberately designed to create friction. So the tribunes, for instance, they had the power of the veto, which literally means I forbid in Latin.
Wow, just I forbid.
Exactly. They could physically stop the machinery of government if they felt the elite were overstepping. And at the very top of the executive branch, they didn't have a president. They had 2 consuls, and they were elected for only a single year.
Just 1 year.
Just one. They shared power, and either one could veto the other. And they even built in an emergency failsafe, which was the dictator.
Right, but I think we need to clarify that. Not a dictator in our modern negative sense. It was a temporary office. Like in a massive crisis, say a foreign invasion, they would grant one man absolute power for 6 months just to solve the problem, and then he was fully expected to step down.
Exactly. It was a remarkably intricate machine of checks, balances, and perm limits.
Yeah.
But here is the critical nuance, and honestly, it's something that is incredibly difficult for modern people to wrap their heads around.
Okay.
This entire sophisticated constitutional framework. Almost all of it was unwritten.
Wait, I have to pause you there because I'm struggling to understand the mechanics of that. If I look at modern democracies, we have massive legal documents, right? We have Supreme Courts to enforce them. If there's no written constitution and no independent judiciary to strike down an unconstitutional act, what actually happens on a random Tuesday when a powerful consul just decides to break the rules?
Yeah, who stops him?
Exactly, who stops him? Is it just the threat of violence?
That is the central paradox of the Roman Republic. It functioned almost entirely on something called the mos maiorum.
The customs of the ancestors.
Yes, the customs of the ancestors. The system relied completely on the collective, voluntary commitment of the ruling class to those traditional norms. There was no, independent police force to arrest a rogue politician. The system worked because the elites collectively agreed to play by the rules.
That sounds incredibly fragile.
It was. They felt bound by honor, by precedent, and by a fierce sense of social pressure. A Roman elite's entire sense of self-worth, which they called their dignitas, was totally tied to how their peers viewed them in relation to these ancestral customs.
So it was essentially a high-stakes, centuries-long game of political peer pressure. Like, as long as everyone felt shame for breaking the rules held.
Precisely. The unwritten constitution was only as strong as the social cohesion of the men operating it, and while when the underlying social and economic conditions of Rome fundamentally changed, that collective commitment to the rules began to erode.
And when that eroded, the Republic just tore itself apart.
Yeah. And what's doubly ironic is that Rome wasn't destroyed by a foreign enemy. I mean, by the 1st century BCE, their military dominance was absolute. They broke themselves, and they broke themselves using the wealth of their own victories.
Let's walk through the mechanics of that self-destruction, because the cause and effect here is so illuminating. I mean, it starts with success. They conquer vast territories, Carthage, Greece, parts of Spain. And this brings an unprecedented tsunami of wealth pouring directly into the hands of the Roman nobility.
Right. Now, what do the nobility actually do with that massive influx of capital?
They don't invest it in, like, industrialization.
No, they invested in the only thing that mattered in the ancient economy, which is land. They begin buying up enormous tracts of public land in Italy, creating these gargantuan agricultural estates known as latifundia.
And this is where the massive human cost comes in. Yeah. To run these mega farms, they don't hire local workers. They use the massive populations of enslaved people that were captured during those exact same foreign conquests.
It just creates a devastating economic chain reaction. I mean, try to put yourself in the sandals of a typical Roman citizen at this time.
Okay, I'm a farmer.
Right. You are a small-scale farmer in Italy. But you are also a soldier because the Roman military at this point is a citizen militia. So you get called up to fight in Spain for, say, 3 years.
No.
While you are gone, your fields go fallow, your family falls into debt, you finally come back, you can't pay your creditors, and you are forced to sell your farm to a wealthy senator, and he just rolls your land into his massive latifundium, which is worked by slave labor that you helped capture.
That is incredibly bleak. So you have a citizen who bled for the Republic, returning home to find he's been completely economically displaced by the Republic's own success. So where does he go?
He really has no choice. He migrates to the city. Hundreds of thousands of dispossessed, bankrupt citizen farmers just flood into Rome. They crowd into these massive, flammable, highly dangerous apartment blocks called insulae. They have no steady income, no land, and no prospects. But they still have one crucial asset.
Their vote.
Exactly, their vote.
Because Rome is still technically a republic. So you've just created a massive, desperate urban underclass that is entirely dependent on political patronage and, like, distributions of cheap or free grain to survive.
You've essentially created a tinderbox. The political temperature skyrockets. Ambitious politicians quickly realize they can just bypass the Senate entirely by appealing directly to this angry urban mob, promising them debt relief and cheap food in exchange for political violence and votes.
And while the city is destabilizing, the military is fundamentally changing too.
This is really the fatal blow, because the traditional system of a citizen militia of property owners is collapsing. Generals have to begin recruiting from the poorest citizens, the men with literally no property. And these new soldiers, they don't look to the Senate for their retirement package because the Senate refuses to give them land.
So they look to the guy paying them.
Exactly. They look exclusively to their general.
The army's basically become privatized in everything but name. A general who conquers a new territory has immense wealth, immense prestige, and tens of thousands of heavily armed veterans who are personally loyal to him, not the state.
Yeah, the Republican institutions were designed for a small city-state balancing local aristocrats. They were utterly incapable of containing global warlords commanding private, state-funded armies. It just became a zero-sum game of elite competition.
Which brings us to the most famous political crisis in ancient history. 49 BCE, Julius Caesar and the Rubicon.
It is the ultimate failure of the Mos Maiorum.
Explain the mechanics of this moment. Why is crossing a small river in northern Italy such a massively big deal?
Well, the Rubicon River marked the formal boundary between the Roman province of Cisalpine Gaul, which Caesar governed, and Italy proper. There was a strict, sacred constitutional prohibition against any military commander bringing his army south of that river. It was the ultimate taboo. To do so was essentially to declare war on the Republic itself.
But Caesar's political enemies in the Senate were trying to strip him of his command and prosecute him.
Right, so Caesar is looking at a choice. Surrender his army and face political ruin and exile, or break the ultimate unwritten rule and march on his own capital.
And he chooses to march. By crossing the Rubicon, Caesar explicitly violates the core of the Constitution. He converts a severe political deadlock into a catastrophic civil war. He shatters the illusion that the rules matter more than power.
He really does.
And Caesar wins the civil war, declares himself dictator for life, and then, in 44 BCE, he is famously assassinated on the Senate floor by a group of senators who genuinely believe that killing him will magically restore the republic.
But of course it doesn't. You can't put the genie back in the bottle. The social and economic conditions that created Caesar still exist. His assassination just triggers another horrific, multi-decade round of civil wars among his successors.
Until his adopted heir, Octavian, who we know as Augustus, finally crushes all opposition and emerges as the sole ruler of the Roman world in 27 BCE. And what Augustus does next is widely considered a masterpiece of political engineering.
It really is an unprecedented sleight of hand. Augustus looks at the corpse of the Republic and realizes something crucial. The Romans will tolerate absolute power, but they will absolutely not tolerate the appearance of a king.
Right, going back to that deep-seated allergy to the word king. So he doesn't sit on a throne and wear a crown?
No, not at all. He officially proclaims that he has restored the Republic. He keeps the Senate, he keeps the elections for consuls and tribunes, he lives in a relatively modest house on the Palatine Hill. He refers to himself simply as princeps, which just means the first citizen.
But it's entirely theater, right? Because behind the scenes, he has systematically concentrated all effective power into his own hands.
Oh, it's a total institutional monopoly. He controls the vast majority of the legions. He directly governs the wealthiest provinces. He controls the treasury. He essentially establishes a military dictatorship dressed up in republican clothing. We call this system the Principate.
It's incredibly cynical, but, we have to admit that it worked. The system Augustus built ended a century of blood-soaked civil war and ushered in an era of stability that is almost hard to fathom.
The Pax Romana, the Roman peace. It lasted roughly 200 years. From Augustus's consolidation of power in 27 BCE all the way to the death of the Emperor Marcus Aurelius in 180 CE.
Let's talk about the sheer scale of the machine during this period, because this is when they build the infrastructure that shaped our modern world. At its height, the empire stretched from the rainy moors of northern Britain all the way to the deserts of Mesopotamia, from the Rhine and Danube rivers down to the Sahara.
We are talking about an estimated population of 50 to 70 million people. That was roughly 1/4 of the entire global population at the time.
Wow.
Yeah, living in hundreds of different cities, speaking dozens of languages, worshiping countless local gods, all under a single political umbrella.
How do you even begin to manage that without the whole thing flying apart?
Well, if you look closely at how they managed this massive territory, it was actually a masterpiece of pragmatic, relatively hands-off administration.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Obviously, it was backed by the constant threat of devastating military force. The legions stationed on the frontiers were always a reminder. But day to day, the Roman deal was highly decentralized.
Meaning they didn't try to force everyone to act Roman.
Exactly. They didn't have the bureaucracy to micromanage local affairs, even if they wanted to. Their philosophy was basically, you can keep your local civic leaders, you can speak Greek or Aramaic or Celtic, and you can absolutely keep worshiping your local gods. As long as you pay your taxes on time, acknowledge the ultimate sovereignty of the emperor, and do not rebel, Rome will largely leave you alone.
But a massive, diverse empire stretching from Britain to Syria can't be held together just by the threat of military violence and a loose agreement to pay taxes. You need a universal system to resolve disputes. You need rules that apply to a grain merchant in Egypt just as much as a blacksmith in Gaul. And that's where their most invisible yet most powerful weapon comes in, which is Roman law.
Oh, absolutely. Roman jurisprudence is arguably the most directly consequential intellectual product of the empire for our world today. It was developed organically by legal scholars over centuries and eventually synthesized and codified by the Emperor Justinian in the 6th century. The conceptual leaps they made really form the bedrock of how we think about justice and commerce today.
Let's break down some of these leaps. For instance, the fundamental distinction between public law, crimes against the state, and private law, which covers disputes between citizens. That categorization is a Roman invention.
Or the procedural norm that the burden of proof lies with the accuser, what we casually call innocent until proven guilty.
Right. But the mechanism that completely blew my mind is the concept of legal personality. I'd always assumed that the idea of a corporation, treating an organization like a person in the eyes of the law was some modern capitalist invention, like something out of the Industrial Revolution.
No, it's a 2,000-year-old administrative hack.
Explain how that works, because it solves such a specific logistical nightmare.
Okay, think about the complexity of running a massive city like Rome. You have guilds of bakers, associations of shipbuilders, religious colleges. Now, these organizations need to own property. They need a guild hall or a warehouse. They need to sign contracts. But if a building is owned jointly by 50 individual bakers and one baker dies, does his specific share go to his son?
Oh, man.
And what if the son isn't a baker? What if a shipbuilder decides to leave the guild? Does he take a percentage of the warehouse with him? The ownership fractures constantly.
Absolute nightmare for enforcing contracts.
Exactly. So Roman jurists invented a legal fiction. They declared that the guild itself is a persona ficta, a fictitious person. The legal entity holds the property and enters the contracts. It outlives any individual member. If the leadership changes, the entity's obligations remain intact. That specific Roman mechanism is the exact legal DNA that allows a modern megacorporation like Apple to own assets, sue, and be sued independently of its individual shareholders.
That is just wild to think about. We are running modern global capitalism on Roman code. And their legal philosophy went even deeper than corporate structure, too. They developed the concept of natural law.
Jus naturale. This is a massive philosophical breakthrough. As Roman jurists encountered hundreds of different local legal systems across the empire, they started looking for commonalities. They began to argue that beneath the specific man-made laws of any given city, there are universal principles of justice that are discoverable by human reason.
The idea that some rights are just inherent to human existence, regardless of what the government says.
Exactly. They posited that this natural law transcends the positive laws of the state. If we trace the intellectual lineage of this idea, it's astonishing. This Roman concept was absorbed into early Christian theology, where natural law was seen as the imprint of God's reason on the universe.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and centuries later, Enlightenment thinkers like John Locke stripped away some of the theology and used it to argue for natural human rights. And from Locke, it became the intellectual foundation for the American founding.
So when Thomas Jefferson writes in the Declaration of Independence about the laws of nature entitling a people to political independence, he is directly channeling a conceptual framework built by Roman lawyers trying to manage an empire.
Without a doubt. But to be fair, the empire wasn't just held together by brilliant legal concepts. It was heavily held together by concrete. We have to talk about the physical infrastructure.
The famous Roman roads. It is really hard to overstate the sheer scale of their engineering. At its peak, the empire maintained a network of approximately 80,000 kilometers of paved all-weather roads.
80,000 kilometers. That is enough paving to circle the globe twice. It is unquestionably the greatest logistical achievement of the ancient world.
And these weren't just dirt tracks, right? They were deeply excavated, multi-layered highways. They had drainage ditches, stone foundations, and paved surfaces. They were built primarily by the legions themselves to ensure that troops could be marched from one end of a province to another with terrifying speed.
Military deployment was definitely the catalyst, yes. But once you build 80,000 kilometers of frictionless infrastructure, you inadvertently revolutionize the economy.
Right, because merchants start using it.
Exactly. The roads, combined with the clearing of piracy from the Mediterranean Sea, allowed for intense commercial integration. Olive oil from Spain, grain from Egypt, pottery from Gaul, glass from Syria, it all moved with unprecedented efficiency. The Mediterranean economy was integrated in a way that literally would not be matched again in Europe until the advent of the railway in the 19th century.
But here is where the story takes a fascinating turn. Because those 80,000 kilometers of paved roads didn't just move armies and massive shipments of grain. They became the perfect, frictionless conduit for ideas. And they ended up facilitating what is arguably the most consequential religious transformation in Western history.
The rise of Christianity.
Let's trace this because the irony of how Christianity conquered Rome is incredible. It starts as a minor, obscure Jewish sect in the 1st century CE, located in the Roman province of Judea, which was this restless, heavily militarized frontier.
And for the first few centuries of its existence, the relationship between the Roman state and Christianity was defined by intermittent but brutal persecution.
We said earlier the Romans were usually tolerant of local gods. Why did they crack down so hard on this one specific group?
Because of exclusivity. A pagan could worship their local god and still participate in the civic rituals honoring the Roman state gods or the genius of the emperor. But Christians, inherited from their Jewish roots, were strictly monotheistic. They absolutely refused to participate in the imperial cult. To a Roman magistrate, this wasn't just a religious difference, it was an act of civic treason. It looked like a dangerous, secretive political subversion.
So you have the famous executions, right? Peter and Paul killed in Rome under the Emperor Nero. And later, as the empire faced severe crises, you had empire-wide systematic persecutions under emperors like Decius and Diocletian, where Christians were forced to sacrifice to the state gods or face execution.
But despite that violent suppression, the religion didn't just survive, it proliferated. And when we look at how it spread so effectively, the answer is the empire itself.
The empire built the very tools used to subvert it.
Exactly. The Roman infrastructure was the internet of antiquity. The early apostles and missionaries literally walked on the Roman road network. They moved safely from city to city because of the Pax Romana.
They relied on the deep commercial networks of the Eastern Mediterranean. And crucially, they relied on language.
The linguistic unity of the East was a massive factor. Greek was the lingua franca, the common language of commerce and culture in the eastern half of the empire. The New Testament was written in Greek. Early Christian theology was debated in Greek. This allowed complex theological ideas to cross ethnic and regional boundaries completely seamlessly. You could preach in Alexandria, Antioch, and Corinth, and everyone understood the exact same concepts.
So the Roman military cleared the roads, the Roman engineers paved them, and the Roman administration enforced a common language, all of which allowed an underground religion to build this empire-wide social network.
It's a brilliant paradox. And the turning points of this movement are just monumental. For 300 years, it's a persecuted minority. Then, in 312 CE, you have the Emperor Constantine. He experiences a vision, wins a major civil war battle at the Milvian Bridge, and attributes his victory to the Christian god.
He politically adopts the religion. And the very next year, in 313 CE, he issues the Edict of Milan.
Which is a massive paradigm shift. The Edict of Milan doesn't make Christianity the official religion, but it officially grants religious toleration to all faiths in the empire. Christianity goes from being a treasonous underground sect to a legally recognized, imperially patronized institution almost overnight.
And the final step happens a few generations later, right? In 380 CE. The Emperor Theodosius VI issues an edict declaring that Nicene Christianity is the sole official state religion of the Roman Empire. Pagan practices are actively suppressed.
Yeah, in the span of 3 centuries, a minor persecuted sect from Judea becomes the official ideological framework of the dominant global superpower. It forged an alliance between church and state that would define Western European civilization straight through the Middle Ages.
And we talked earlier about how the physical administration of the church just mapped onto the Roman provinces. But this religious and administrative dominance didn't just leave us with church hierarchies and cathedrals. It literally hijacked the English language we are speaking right now.
The linguistic legacy is really one of the most intimate ways Rome still impacts us today.
I mean, if you look at English vocabulary today, roughly 60% of our words are derived either directly from Latin or from French, which is itself just a Latin-descended language.
And this Latin vocabulary didn't just arrive all at once. It entered English through several distinct channels over centuries. The early Christian missionaries brought Latin terms for religion and learning. During the Renaissance, scholars deliberately injected thousands of classical Latin terms into English to handle new concepts in science, medicine, and philosophy.
But the most dramatic, forced injection came through military conquest, didn't it?
Yes. The Norman conquest of England in 1066.
Right. When French-speaking Normans conquered Anglo-Saxon England, they replaced the entire ruling class. The court, the law, the military. It all began operating in a Latinate language, French. Meanwhile, the common people continued speaking Germanic Old English.
And this created a sociolinguistic phenomenon that shapes how we intuitively judge people's intelligence and social class today. It's called systematic register associations.
It's absolutely fascinating. The conquest stratified the language. Basically, the Germanic words, the original visceral words of the native English speakers, became the vocabulary of the commoners, of the dirt and the home. But the Latinate words, brought over by the conquerors, became the prestige variety. They became the words of power, administration, and high culture.
So we ended up with this massive inventory of near synonyms that mean the exact same thing, but carry drastically different social weights.
Let's look at some examples, because once you hear this, you really can't unhear it. Take the Germanic word begin, versus the Latinate word commence.
They refer to the exact same action. But if you walk into a room and say, "We will now commence the meeting," you instantly sound more formal, more elevated, perhaps slightly bureaucratic. If you say, "Let's begin," it's just casual.
Or look at ask versus inquire or interrogate.
That is a perfect gradient. Ask is Germanic, everyday. Inquire is Latinate, formal, polite. Interrogate is Latinate, but it implies institutional power and force. You ask your friend a question, the police interrogate a suspect.
Even religious words do this. Holy versus sacred.
Right. Holy comes from Old English. Feels older, more visceral, almost mystical. Sacred is Latinate. It feels institutional, doctrinal, tied to a church structure.
Understanding this dynamic gives you a literal superpower in navigating professional and academic English. If you understand that Latin-derived words subconsciously signal to the listener a higher register, greater formality, and more abstract authority, you can consciously tailor your speech. You know exactly which levers to pull.
It completely illuminates why our modern legal vocabulary is almost exclusively Latinate. The law is the ultimate expression of state power, so it uses the prestige language.
Think about the words lawyers use every day: contract, obligation, liability, jurisdiction, defendant, plaintiff, verdict, precedent, statute, constitution, legislation, judicial, civil, criminal. Every single one of those derives from Roman legal terminology.
By learning the roots of these terms, we aren't just learning trivia, we are tracing the lineage of authority. It connects our contemporary discourse directly back to the Roman magistrates.
Okay, so we've spent a lot of time marveling at this incredible legacy. The constitutional mechanisms, the roads, the legal hacks, the language. And usually when people talk about Rome's greatness, it leads inevitably to a morbid fascination with the dramatic, fiery collapse of Rome.
The legendary fall of the Roman Empire.
Right. But before we get to the fall, there is a massive historical blind spot that we absolutely have to address. It's a misconception that completely distorts our understanding of Western history. Half of the Roman Empire didn't fall at all.
It is a persistent and profound frustration for historians how systematically Western culture undervalues the Eastern Roman Empire.
The empire we now call Byzantium.
Exactly. We are so hyper-focused on the collapse of the Western provinces, Gaul, Britain, Italy, Spain in the 5th century, that we completely ignore the fact that the continuous Roman state survived and often thrived in the East for nearly 1,000 more years.
1,000 years. I mean, think about that timeline. The Western Empire nominally falls in 476 CE. But the Eastern Roman Empire, ruled from Constantinople, doesn't collapse until the Ottoman Turks breach the city walls with cannons in 1453 CE.
Let's put that in perspective. That final collapse in 1453 is 2,206 years after the traditional founding of Rome, and it is 977 years after the West supposedly fell. They had an almost incomprehensible run of continuous statecraft.
So wait. If the West fell apart into fractured, decentralized, illiterate kingdoms, how did the East survive for another millennium facing many of the exact same pressures?
It really comes down to geography, economics, and diplomacy. The East was always the wealthier, more urbanized, more populous half of the empire. They controlled the massive grain wealth of Egypt and the deep commercial hubs of Syria and Asia Minor. This gave them a vastly superior tax base.
So they could actually afford to pay their armies. They could pay their armies, and perhaps more importantly, they could afford to bribe their enemies. When massive nomadic confederacies threatened their borders, the Eastern emperors frequently used their massive gold reserves to pay them off, or pay them to attack someone else.
That's incredibly practical.
It was. Furthermore, their capital, Constantinople, was situated on a highly defensible peninsula and surrounded by the Theodosian walls, which were virtually impregnable until the invention of gunpowder.
While the city of Rome is being sacked and its population is shrinking to a fraction of its former size, Constantinople is this thriving metropolis with running water, massive chariot races in the hippodrome, and complex theological debates. So why does Western history ignore them?
Primarily because the narrative of modern Western Europe was built on the ashes of the Western Empire. The Germanic kings who took over the West wanted to claim the mantle of Rome for themselves, like Charlemagne crowning himself Holy Roman Emperor.
Right.
To do that, they had to delegitimize the actual Romans still living in the East, painting them as overly intellectual, decadent Greeks.
But the irony is that the West owes its intellectual survival to that so-called decadent Eastern Empire. The cultural and legal preservation happening in Byzantium is the bridge to the modern world.
They served as the vital vault of classical civilization, the foundational Greek texts of philosophy, mathematics, and science, like Plato, Aristotle, Euclid, Archimedes. They were largely lost or forgotten in Western Europe during the early Middle Ages. But they were being copied, studied, and commented upon continuously in Byzantine monasteries and imperial libraries.
And when the Byzantine state finally weakened, and scholars began fleeing west to Italy before the fall of Constantinople in 1453, they brought those Greek manuscripts with them.
That specific migration of Byzantine scholars and classical Greek texts was one of the primary catalysts that sparked the Italian Renaissance.
That's just incredible. And it's not just philosophy either. Even the legal code we talked about earlier, Justinian's massive codification of Roman law in the 6th century, that wasn't a Western achievement. Justinian ruled from Constantinople. That was an Eastern Roman project.
Exactly. The Corpus Juris Civilis was compiled in the East. Centuries later, a copy was rediscovered in Italy, and it became the foundation for the revival of legal studies in Western European universities in the 12th and 13th centuries. The West owes an immense, largely unacknowledged debt to the East for literally keeping the lights on.
But acknowledging that the East survived and had the resources and structural integrity to last another 1,000 years actually makes the question of the West's collapse in the 5th century even more fascinating. I mean, why did the Western half of this incredibly successful machine break down so completely?
The anatomy of the Western collapse is probably the most fiercely debated topic in historical scholarship. How does a superpower dissolve?
The traditional date we are always given in school is 476 CE. That's the year a Germanic mercenary general named Odoacer deposes a teenager, fittingly named Romulus Augustulus, the last Western emperor, and basically decides not to bother appointing a new one. But it wasn't a sudden event, was it?
Not at all. 476 is just a convenient milestone. There was no single catastrophic heart attack that killed the empire. It was an agonizing, multi-century process of structural deterioration. It involved economic spirals, demographic shifts, political fragmentation, and military crises all feeding into each other. Pointing to one single cause is honestly just intellectually lazy.
Let's address one of the most famous single-cause theories, just to clear the air. We brought up Edward Gibbon earlier. In his massive 18th century history, he argued that Christianity was the primary culprit. His theory was that the new religion made the Romans too pacifist, too focused on the afterlife, and it destroyed the old martial civic virtues that built the empire. Did Christianity make Rome too soft to defend itself?
It is an incredibly seductive and influential theory, largely because Gibbon was a brilliant writer. But it is cleanly and definitively debunked by modern scholarship.
How do historians disprove it?
The simplest way is to look at the timeline. It just doesn't work. Gibbon argues that Christian civic virtues replaced Roman martial ones. But Christianity doesn't become the sole official religion of the empire until Theodosius I in 380 CE. By that point, the severe structural, economic, and military pressures that would ultimately break the Western machine had already been grinding the empire down for over 150 years.
The rot was already deep in the wood before Christianity took over the building.
Exactly. And furthermore, if you look at the 4th and 5th centuries, the Christianized Roman Empire was just as brutally militaristic and violently defensive as the pagan empire had been. Rather than being an agent of dissolution, the institutional church actually became a primary vehicle for attempting to preserve Roman administrative continuity as the political center failed.
Okay, so if we discard the Christianity theory, what actually broke the machine? What is the real anatomy of the collapse?
It is a massive doom loop, a cycle of interacting pressures. But the root cause, the fatal flaw in the system, was the overextension of the imperial frontier relative to their fiscal capacity.
They grew too big to afford their own security.
Precisely. The empire was bordered by the Rhine and Danube rivers in the north, and the Persian Empire in the east. To defend thousands of miles of frontier against increasingly sophisticated enemies, they had to maintain a massive standing professional army.
Let's trace the mechanics of this doom loop because it sounds devastatingly modern. To pay for this massive army, the state needs a huge amount of revenue. But the ancient economy is overwhelmingly agrarian. It doesn't grow fast enough to meet the spiking military costs. So what does the government do?
They do what governments often do when they can't balance the budget. They manipulate the currency. The Roman state began systematically debasing the silver denarius. They put less and less actual silver in the coins, allowing them to mint more coins to pay the troops.
But the merchants aren't stupid. They realize the coins are worth less, so they raise their prices, which triggers rampant inflation.
Hyperinflation in some periods. And this crushes the economic activity of the middle class. But, more dangerously, it means the soldier's pay is essentially worthless. When a heavily armed professional soldier realizes his salary can no longer buy food for his family, he doesn't write a letter to his congressman. He mutinies.
And he turns to his general, the only guy who can promise him gold, which triggers civil war.
Exactly. This dynamic explodes during what historians call the Third Century Crisis, from roughly 235 to 284 CE. It was a terrifying 50-year period where the entire system nearly vaporized.
What does a near collapse look like on the ground?
Well, you have simultaneous massive invasions by Germanic confederacies across the Rhine and by the resurgent Persian Empire in the east. The economy is in total freefall due to inflation and a devastating plague. And politically, it's a bloodbath. You have a rapid, chaotic turnover of emperors. In one 50-year span, there were over 24 claimants to the throne.
Because every time an army on the frontier got angry, they just declared their own general the new emperor and marched on Rome to take the treasury.
And when you pull the legions away from the Rhine frontier to march on Rome to fight another Roman army, what happens?
The frontier is left completely undefended. The door is wide open for invaders.
It's a perfect, vicious cycle. Civil war weakens the borders, which invites invasion, which requires a larger army, which requires more taxes and currency debasement, which causes more economic ruin, which causes more mutinies and civil wars.
It's astonishing they survived that century at all. They do eventually recover, right?
Yeah.
Under emperors like Diocletian and later Constantine.
They do recover, but at an immense cost. The empire that survives the Third Century Crisis is fundamentally transformed. To stabilize the state, Diocletian essentially turns the empire into a totalitarian fortress. The bureaucracy is massively expanded, taxes are made ruthlessly efficient and oppressive, peasants are legally tied to their land, effectively creating the origins of medieval serfdom.
So the state survives, but the freedom and economic mobility of the average citizen are completely crushed under the weight of the military-industrial complex.
And crucially, even after all these reforms, they never solved their glaring structural weakness, which was the succession mechanism.
Right, because Augustus built the system on the fiction that it was still a republic, not a monarchy. There was never a clear, constitutionally mandated rule for who takes over when an emperor dies.
Which meant that every time an emperor died without a terrifyingly strong adult heir, the system devolved back into civil war. The Romans killed more Roman soldiers than the barbarians ever did.
Which perfectly sets the stage for the Germanic migrations. And this is another area where popular culture gets it wrong. We tend to imagine the barbarian invasions as millions of people suddenly pouring over the border one day with torches looking to burn down civilization.
It was much more complex and insidious than that. The Germanic peoples, the Goths, the Franks, the Vandals, they didn't initially come to destroy the empire. They wanted to join it. They were often fleeing pressures from the east, like the Huns.
So they came as refugees.
They came as refugees, they came as agricultural settlers, and crucially, they came as soldiers. Because the Roman citizen body was exhausted and depleted, the Roman state increasingly relied on hiring entire Germanic tribes to serve as mercenaries to fight other Germanic tribes.
They outsourced their own defense to the very people they were trying to keep out.
Yes. And over time, as the central government in Italy grew weaker and poorer, these Germanic military commanders realized they didn't need to take orders from a powerless emperor in Ravenna or Rome. They could just run the provinces themselves. Their later role as conquerors and kings of independent territories was as much a symptom of Roman institutional vacuum as it was a cause.
Now, I've heard an argument recently in some academic circles that pushes back against the whole idea of a fall. The argument is that Rome didn't actually collapse. It just gracefully transformed culturally into late antiquity. That it was a relatively smooth transition into a multicultural medieval Europe. Is that accurate?
This is a major debate, but the scholarship we are looking at brings in historians like Peter Heather and Brian Ward Perkins to insist that, no, we absolutely cannot downplay the violence and the catastrophe of this period. It wasn't a gentle transition. It was a brutal civilizational collapse in the West.
Ward Perkins uses archaeological data to prove this, right? And it is terrifying because it isn't based on dramatic texts written by elites. It's based on the physical garbage left behind by normal people.
Exactly. He looks at measurable proxies for economic complexity. And the data shows that the standard of living in the West plummeted drastically.
Tell me about the pottery, because that example stuck with me.
During the height of the empire, even a poor farmer in northern Britain would eat off high-quality, mass-produced pottery manufactured in North Africa or Gaul. The trade networks were that deep and efficient. But after the 5th century, the quality and quantity of pottery drops off a cliff. Those massive trade networks completely vanish. People go back to making crude, unglazed pots by hand over local fires, exactly as they had done in the Iron Age.
So the complex economy just ceases to exist.
Building construction in stone largely halts. Tile roofs disappear in many regions. Literacy rates plummet because the economic need for written contracts vanishes. And perhaps the most visceral data point, Ward Perkins notes that the physical size of cattle actually shrinks back to prehistoric levels.
Wait, the cows got smaller.
Hey.
How does a political collapse shrink a cow?
Because the massive interconnected agricultural breeding networks that the Romans maintained to produce large, high-yield livestock collapsed. The localized, fragmented farming that replaced it couldn't sustain those breeds. The physical deterioration of the world was absolute.
Think of the Western Empire not as a majestic building that was suddenly knocked down by a wrecking ball, but like a sprawling corporate monopoly that expanded too fast, took on massive debt to pay its security guards, cannibalized its own workers, and slowly had its market share eaten by agile local startups, the Germanic tribes, until the corporate headquarters just quietly went bankrupt and the supply chains broke.
That is a highly accurate way to visualize it. The complexity unwound.
And looking at that terrifying material decline, the idea that a society can achieve that level of sophistication and then just lose it, it inevitably makes us look in the mirror. Which brings us to the final and perhaps most important aspect of our deep dive, the Roman mirror.
Ever since 1776, which is coincidentally the exact same year Gibbon published his first volume on Rome's decline, intellectuals and politicians have constantly compared modern hegemonic powers to falling Rome.
Especially the United States. It's almost a cliche at this point. Are we Rome? We hear it on the news constantly. How valid is this comparison? Are we actually on the same trajectory?
The analogy is drawn constantly in both serious scholarship and popular commentary, and it is important to realize that the comparison is both genuinely illuminating and heavily prone to distortion.
Let's start with the illuminating parallels. If we look at the structural mechanics we've discussed today, what are the genuinely frightening similarities between Rome's unraveling and our modern global situation?
The structural challenges are strikingly uncomfortably familiar. First, there is the struggle to maintain complex, representative institutions amidst rapidly rising economic inequality and deep internal political polarization.
The modern equivalent of the latifundia displacing the middle class. Check.
Second, the chronic problem of overextended military commitments across the globe that are slowly being drained by fiscal limits and mounting national debt.
The struggle to pay the legions without debasing the currency. Check.
Third, the immense difficulty of managing migration at the massive scale required by imperial labor and demographic demands, but attempting to do so without breaking the political and cultural cohesion of the center.
Which is a tension dominating the domestic politics of almost every Western nation today. Check.
And finally, and perhaps most importantly, given our discussion of the Republic, there is the erosion of shared ideological commitment. We talked about how Rome's republic relied entirely on the mos maiorum, the unwritten customs of the ancestors. Rome's capacity to sustain its civic institutions depended on a shared elite commitment to those rules. When the social and economic conditions changed, the shame associated with breaking the rules vanished, the commitment eroded, and the institutions failed.
The loss of our own modern mos maiorum. The idea that political actors no longer feel bound by the unwritten norms of democratic behavior. That is chilling. But while those parallels are stark, I want to caution everyone listening against what historians call presentism. Rome was fundamentally an ancient, agrarian, slave-based economy. Their mechanisms were entirely unique to their time.
It is very easy to use Rome as a cheap rhetorical device. People have a strong tendency to select only the features of the Roman collapse that happen to support their own predetermined political conclusions. Rome fell because of taxes, or Rome fell because of immigrants, or Rome fell because of moral decay. It's a trap. It reduces a multi-century structural unwinding to a partisan talking point.
And there's another trap here, a concept called the teleological imposition of decline.
That is a vital concept for anyone studying history.
Historians use that clunky phrase, but all it really means is reading history backward. If you were a Roman farmer living in Gaul in the year 410, you didn't wake up, look at your calendar, and say, the The empire is currently in a state of terminal decline. You were just living your life. You were complaining about higher taxes, worrying about the harvest, and maybe noting that the new local warlord speaks a Germanic dialect instead of Latin. People adapt.
Yeah.
It is only us, looking backward centuries later with full knowledge of how the story ends, who draw a red line on a timeline and call it a collapse.
Exactly. Decline is rarely experienced as a dramatic plunge by the people living through it. It is experienced as a series of localized adaptations to worsening circumstances.
So, synthesizing everything we've explored today, from the unwritten constitution of the Republic to the brilliant legal hacks of the empire to the catastrophic unwinding of their economy and borders, what is the ultimate takeaway? What does this massive data set of human behavior actually mean for us?
The grand lesson is this: Rome is not a literal template for our future. We are not fated to repeat their exact sequence of events. But Rome stands as the ultimate, undeniable case study in the fragility of institutional resilience.
Highly sophisticated, incredibly durable, wildly successful institutions, systems that can build 80,000 kilometers of roads and define the laws of continents. They do not die from one sudden calm.
No, they don't. They die from the cumulative, slow erosion of the underlying social and economic conditions that made them work in the first place. They rot from the inside out until a stiff breeze, a political crisis, an economic shock, a migration event just knocks them over.
Thank you for walking through this incredible architecture with me. It fundamentally changes how you look at a modern city or a legal document.
It has been an absolute pleasure to unpack the mechanics of it all.
And thank you for joining us on this deep dive.